Somewhere in a Shenzhen retail store right now, a customer is holding two phones side by side. One says Apple, one says Huawei. And for the first time in 5 years, statistically, they're more likely to walk out with the Huawei. Here's the reality anchor. This already happened. It's not a projection or an analyst's guess. It's a closed fiscal year. Huawei shipped 46.7 million phones in China in 2025. Apple shipped 46.2 million. 500,000 units apart, roughly the entire population of a mid-sized American city like Atlanta, decided the outcome of the biggest smartphone rivalry on the planet and the single largest smartphone market on Earth, and almost nobody outside China noticed it happen in real time. But the sales number is genuinely the least interesting part of this story. Here's the part that should actually stop you. Huawei didn't win by cutting prices or copying an iPhone's design language. They won by building something that has never once existed in the entire history of consumer electronics. A smartphone where every layer, the chip inside it, the operating system running it, the app store on its screen, the cloud handling its data, was designed, manufactured, and operated entirely inside one country, with zero components, zero code, and zero services originating from any American company anywhere in the supply chain. If that sounds like it shouldn't be technically possible, good. Because for the better part of a decade, the US government agreed with you and built an entire strategy on the assumption that it wasn't. By the time we're done here, you'll understand exactly how that assumption collapsed. Hit like and subscribe now because the follow-up to this story is already in motion and you don't want to be catching it a month late. To understand how we got here, we need to rewind to the exact moment the United States tried to switch Huawei off entirely and very nearly succeeded. In May 2019, Washington placed Huawei on what's called the Entity List, a designation that meant, effective almost immediately, American companies could no longer do business with Huawei without special federal approval, no grace period, no phase-out window, no workarounds. Google had to sever ties within days, which meant no more Android security updates, no Google Maps, no Gmail, no YouTube, no Play Store. And for context, that's roughly equivalent to a car manufacturer suddenly losing access to engines. You cannot patch around that. Over a weekend, the entire product architecture collapses from the inside. And the restrictions didn't stop at software. Any chip fabrication facility on Earth that used American manufacturing equipment, which is to say virtually every serious chip factory that exists, was now legally barred from producing chips for Huawei, including TSMC in Taiwan, the most advanced chip fab on the planet and Huawei's primary chip supplier for years. That single rule didn't just clip Huawei's access in America, it severed them from the entire global chip supply chain in one move. The damage was immediate and brutal. In 2019, Huawei controlled roughly 17 out of every 100 smartphones sold worldwide, putting them in the same tier as Samsung and Apple. By 2021, that number had collapsed to under 3 out of every 100, meaning Huawei lost more than 80% of its global market position in under 24 months. Their entire international phone business effectively erased. Tech publications ran headlines calling it one of the cleanest, most surgical uses of America's control over global tech infrastructure ever executed. And they weren't wrong. The strategy was working exactly as designed. But while the obituaries were being written on the outside, something almost invisible was happening on the inside. Engineers inside China were confronting problems they'd spent a decade simply outsourcing. Because outsourcing had always been faster and cheaper, and now, for the first time, urgency finally outweighed convenience. To understand what came next, you need to understand one machine most people have never heard of. A Dutch company called ASML builds the only equipment on Earth capable of etching the impossibly small circuit patterns required for cutting-edge computer chips, patterns measured in nanometers, and 1 nanometer is roughly 100,000 times thinner than a single strand of human hair. No competitor exists, no substitute exists. If you want to manufacture the world's most advanced chips, you need an ASML machine, full stop. And the United States had spent years coordinating with the Netherlands and other allies, specifically to keep China's chip industry locked out of ASML's most advanced systems. Without that machine, the logic went, China was capped, stuck manufacturing older, slower chips indefinitely, unable to compete at the top tier no matter how much money or talent they threw at the problem. That logic was sound, coordinated, and backed by years of careful policy work, right up until August 2023, when Huawei quietly released a phone called the Mate 60 Pro. No major press event, no bold marketing claims, almost deliberately understated. Then, researchers cracked it open, and what they found stopped chip labs across the world cold. China's own fabrication plant, SMIC in Shanghai, had figured out how to stack older, less precise manufacturing processes on top of each other, layer after layer, pass after pass, to reach a level of precision experts had insisted was physically impossible without the exact machine China didn't have. It's the engineering equivalent of being told you cannot build a skyscraper without a crane. and coming back 3 years later with a functioning skyscraper built entirely out of ladders and rope, something every expert would have called impossible on paper, standing there fully operational in practice. And the timing wasn't accidental either. The phone went on sale while the U.S. Secretary of Commerce was in Beijing for trade negotiations, a message delivered with surgical precision and received loud and clear in Washington. 2 years later, on November 25th, 2025, Huawei launched the Mate 80 Pro Max, built around a new chip called the Kirin 90 30 Pro, independently benchmarked by researchers at Tech Insights as approaching the density of chips Apple was shipping just a few years earlier, with Huawei claiming a 42% performance jump over the previous year's model, a figure independent testing largely confirmed. But the number that actually matters here isn't on a benchmark chart, it's on a map. Design, fabrication, materials, testing, and packaging all happen inside China, start to finish, completely outside the reach of any American export restriction. To be fair, Apple's chip engineering still leads on several specific performance measures. This isn't a claim that Huawei has surpassed Apple outright. It's that Huawei built a flagship chip with zero exposure to the exact choke point that nearly destroyed them in 2019. That chip alone would already be a remarkable story on its own. But sitting on top of it was a piece of software that may be the single most ambitious engineering project any consumer tech company has attempted in 20 years. And that story is somehow even harder to believe. Here's a fact most people never stop to consider. Every smartphone on Earth in 2019 ran on one of exactly two operating systems. And both were American, Android built on Google's foundation, iOS built entirely by Apple. Two options, both deeply wired into the global app economy. Companies had tried to break that duopoly before and tried seriously. Microsoft poured billions of dollars into Windows Phone. Samsung, one of the largest tech companies alive, built an operating system called Tizen. Nokia built one called MeeGo. BlackBerry attempted a full pivot. Every single attempt failed, not from bad engineering, but from one brutal trap. No developer wants to build apps for a platform with no users, and no user wants a platform with no apps. A closed loop that had swallowed four separate corporate giants whole. So when Google severed ties with Huawei in 2019, the near-universal industry assumption was that Huawei would do the sensible thing, strip Google's proprietary layer off open-source Android, run a degraded version underneath, and quietly accept the limitations. And for a while, that's precisely what happened. The earliest versions of Harmony OS were essentially Android wearing a Huawei interface, with Google's core code still doing the actual heavy lifting underneath. Then, on October 22nd, 2024, Huawei did something that genuinely startled even analysts who'd been tracking them closely for years. They launched Harmony OS Next, and this version shared nothing with what came before. The Android code was gone, not disguised, not layered over, removed entirely. The underlying Linux foundation Android itself is built on, gone as well. In its place sat an entirely new operating system built from the ground up on Huawei's own core, called Hongmeng, with a Huawei-built compiler, Huawei-built developer tools, and even a Huawei-designed programming language called ArcTS. Every single layer of the stack, from the deepest kernel to the interface under your thumb, was new, was Huawei's, and contained not one line of American-originated code, the exact wall that had already defeated Microsoft, Samsung, Nokia, and BlackBerry. The difference this time was a leverage none of those four companies ever had. A captive domestic market north of 1 billion people, a government with every incentive to see the project succeed, and an existential mandate that made failure simply unavailable as an outcome. But an operating system with no apps installed is still, functionally, just an extremely expensive calculator, and that problem still had to be solved from scratch. When Harmony OS Next launched in September 2024, it carried roughly 10,000 native apps, a number that sounds almost respectable until you set it against Apple's App Store, which carries north of 1.8 million apps, or Google Play, which carries over 3 million, meaning Harmony launched with roughly 0.5% of Apple's total catalog, a rounding error, not a competitor. But Huawei wasn't playing the same game Apple and Google were playing. Instead of chasing raw app count globally, they asked one narrow, ruthless question. What software does a person in China actually open every single day? The handful of apps so structurally essential that a phone without them is functionally unusable. WeChat, the messaging and payments platform used by over 1 billion people daily, was rebuilt natively from scratch inside Huawei's own development environment. Not ported, not emulated. Alipay, the payment app hundreds of millions use for everything from groceries to rent, rebuilt. Douyin, the domestic version of TikTok, rebuilt. Every major national bank's app, rebuilt. The mandatory national tax filing platform used by millions of businesses, rebuilt. These weren't lifestyle extras. They were the literal infrastructure of daily functioning in modern Chinese life, and Huawei went after every single one with total focus. By November 2025, Harmony OS crossed 300,000 native apps. By March 2026, it passed 350,000 and was still climbing, meaning in roughly 14 months, Huawei went from 0.5% of Apple's app catalog to a fully functioning software ecosystem developers were actively choosing to build for. The market data confirms exactly what that acceleration produced. In the final quarter of 2024, Counterpoint Research measured Harmony OS at 19 out of every 100 actively used smartphones in China, against iOS at 17 out of every 100, meaning for the first time in the entire history of the modern smartphone, a non-American operating system had overtaken iOS inside the world's largest smartphone market. Those numbers are striking on their own, but they're really just the visible surface of something structurally much bigger. And to understand why it matters this much, you have to understand the one principle that quietly underwrote 4 decades of American technology dominance and why that principle just stopped holding. For roughly 40 years, American tech leverage rested on one consistent, almost invisible law. No matter where on earth you were building a technology product, at least one critical piece of what you needed, somewhere in the chain, came from an American company or ran through American infrastructure. Build a phone anywhere in the world and you needed Qualcomm chips or TSMC fabs running on American lithography equipment, Android or iOS as your operating system, the Play Store or App Store to distribute software, American cloud infrastructure to hold the data, American development tools to write the code, always, somewhere, an American layer. That wasn't just commercial dominance, it was strategic leverage in its purest form because it meant there was always at least one wire Washington could cut if a company or country stepped out of line, chips, software updates, cloud access. Any single cut collapsed the whole structure. It worked on Huawei in 2019 with brutal, near-total efficiency. But look at what Huawei had actually assembled by 2025. Chip design from their own HiSilicon division, fabrication at SMIC in Shanghai, an operating system built on their own proprietary core, their own compiler, their own developer tools, their own programming language, their own app store called App Gallery, their own cloud and account infrastructure through Huawei Mobile Services. Every layer, from raw silicon to the interface under your thumb, sourced, built, and operated without a single American company touching any part of the chain. There is, quite literally, no wire left to cut. The exact strategy that nearly ended Huawei in 2019 cannot be redeployed against the Huawei that exists today, because the company the sanctions were designed to dismantle no longer exists in any meaningful sense. It was replaced by something the industry has genuinely never encountered before: a fully sovereign consumer technology platform operating at a scale of hundreds of millions of devices. That's not a stronger phone Apple ran into in China. That's an entirely different set of rules Apple didn't know it was playing by. The iPhone 16 lineup wasn't a weak product. It was competitive, well-engineered, priced exactly the way Apple always prices its phones. But the invisible protection Apple had quietly relied on for years. The assumption that any serious Chinese rival was permanently one policy decision away from being crippled had silently expired. Apple responded with unusually aggressive discounting in early 2025, and it helped at the margins, but it never changed the underlying trajectory. Now, to be fair, this is not the same as saying Huawei has replaced Apple everywhere. Harmony OS's presence outside China remains close to non-existent, and Huawei's global smartphone share is still a fraction of where it stood before 2019. This is a domestic victory first, an international one second, if at all, and that distinction matters. But domestic is exactly where the real significance lives, because Huawei has already announced plans to push Harmony OS past 100 million active devices by the end of 2026, spanning tablets, laptops, smart TVs, connected vehicles, and industrial systems, meaning this was never actually a phone operating system story. It's the opening chapter of a platform for everything story. And the same underlying method, build every critical layer domestically so no single external point of failure exists, is directly transferable to AI computing hardware, electric vehicle software, cloud infrastructure, and industrial automation, essentially any domain where the United States currently holds a choke point. Here's the part that should genuinely concern policymakers watching this unfold. Once a country proves it can build one complete sovereign technology stack from zero under sanction pressure, the second stack comes faster because the institutional knowledge already exists. The supply chains are already mapped. The engineering culture is already trained on exactly this kind of problem. The Mate 80 Pro Max isn't necessarily the most technically dominant smartphone on the planet today. Apple still wins on specific benchmarks, but it is proof of concept in the most literal sense possible. Proof that a company can be cut off entirely from the world's best tools, rebuild every single layer of a technology stack without outside assistance, and still come out the other side, winning in the market at real scale. For the first time since the personal computer was invented on American soil, there now exists a complete, functioning, consumer-scale technology platform that depends on zero American components, zero American software, and zero American infrastructure at any layer whatsoever. And what that means for chip design, AI infrastructure, and the entire architecture of the global tech economy over the next decade is a question every major government and every major tech company on Earth is now quietly scrambling to answer. So here's the fast version. Washington cut Huawei off from Google, from TSMC, from the entire American-linked chip supply chain in 2019, and watched their global share collapse from 17% to under 3% almost overnight. 4 years later, Huawei answered with a chip nobody thought was physically possible without equipment they didn't have access to. 2 years after that, they answered again with an entire operating system built from absolute zero, no Android, no Linux, no American code anywhere in the stack, and grew it from 10,000 apps to over 350,000 in roughly 14 months. By late 2024, that operating system had already overtaken iOS inside China. By 2025, Huawei had overtaken Apple in total phone sales inside the world's largest smartphone market for the first time in 5 years. Zoom out. And this was never really a story about one company's comeback. It's a demonstration that the single greatest source of American technological leverage for 40 straight years, the guarantee that at least one wire could always be cut, only works until the day someone successfully builds around every wire at once. And once that happens for the first time, it becomes dramatically easier to do a second time and a third. The lesson the industry was supposed to learn from Huawei in 2019 was simple. Challenge American tech dominance and get dismantled. The lesson the industry is actually learning in 2026 is the exact opposite one. If this changed how you think about where technology power is actually headed, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next, because this story is still moving. Now I want to hear it from you honestly. Do you think Apple can win China back, or has this shift already become permanent? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single one.